All right, it's 2:15, so we can get going. This is Jack Dwyer, Executive Director of the North Dakota Upper Missouri Water Association. Our final presentation is Transportation Budgets, WOTUS, and More, a DC update. Our presenter is Ian Lyle. Ian is the Executive Vice President of the National Water Resources Association. The NWRA is a Washington, DC based federation focused on representing the interests of Western water in our nation's capital. NWRA is made up of agricultural and municipal water providers and state associations, including the North Dakota Water Users Association. Ian is a Colorado native with over 16 years of experience working on natural resource issues. He lives in Washington, DC, but still considers the West home. Thanks for being with us today, Ian.
Well, thank you, Jack. I appreciate the welcome and appreciate the opportunity to join you all today. I want to first thank Jack, Julie, and the full team over there for the good work in putting today's event together. I know we'd all love to be in person, but given the circumstances, I think a lot of folks are still using the virtual option. So congratulations to the team for putting together a virtual event, because I know these things are tough. And thanks to all of you for joining, because I know it's also sometimes tough to carve out time in your schedules for these types of meetings. But really look forward to being able to see you guys in person sometime in the next couple months. There's been a lot going on here in DC, and I am going to try to share my screen. So if you guys will bear with me while I tinker with technology, which is not my forte. There we go. Let's see here. Jack, does that look okay, sir? All right. Well, thank you again. As Jack mentioned, NWRA is an association of water users, but we're based in Washington, D.C., and we try to do our best to represent your interests here in our nation's capital. One of the key things that we try to focus on is the difference in Western water as compared to some of the Eastern water and some of the issues that folks on the East Coast are more familiar with. That includes a specific focus on water rights, groundwater, and how that interaction pertains to the role of the state and the role of the federal government. We also try to highlight the key differences for regulatory matters, including the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and things like forest health, which are much more of an issue, especially as some of you in Montana and other forested areas have recently learned with some of the tough fire seasons we've had over the last couple of years. Initially we were supposed to be in Deadwood, and so I think trying to have a little bit of fun with it, I tried to go with the good, the bad, and the ugly of what's going on in DC with respect to water and water infrastructure. Let me first state that, like anything, there are levels of good and bad. And so just because I got something listed as good doesn't mean it's all entirely good, or something is bad doesn't mean it's necessarily all bad. There's levels to it, but in general, there are things that are going on the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then there's also some opportunities to make the good better, make the bad better, and hopefully try to pretty up the ugly a little bit. So on the infrastructure front, I do think this is one of the positives, or one of the good things that are going on in DC. There are really two large bills that we're following. They're both on separate tracks, but they are interrelated, and that interrelation is largely due to politics. The first bill is, I really call it the infrastructure bill, or the concrete and steel infrastructure bill. It's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is the kind of the first of the two bills, and it is primarily what I would consider your more traditional infrastructure, your roads, your bridges, your ports funding, your water infrastructure funding. And then there's the reconciliation bill, which does have some traditional infrastructure components in it, but as I'll talk about a little bit later, is more kind of on like the social program side, has a more emphasis on those types of programs. As I mentioned, these are two different bills, but their fates are somewhat interconnected. And that goes back to the current makeup in both the House of Representatives and the US Senate. In the Senate, you have a 50-50 split. I mean, really, it's 48-2 to 50. There's 48 Republicans, or 48 Democrats, 2 independents, and 50 Republicans. But those 2 independents caucus with the Democrats. So you really effectually have a 50-50 split. And then the vice president has the tie vote, which gives Democrats the majority in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, and the nature of the body in the House is that it is a majority rule body. Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives, but it's not a huge majority. Depending on retirements and things like that, since the beginning of the year, it's fluctuated from 9 to about 4 or 5 seats. And right now, I think it's 5-seat majority that the Democrats have in the House of Representatives. So in both chambers, you're dealing with very narrow margins, but you're also dealing with two very different kind of pockets within the Democratic Party. In the Senate, the moderates, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, have a lot of power. They have exerted that power in the development of the infrastructure bill and also with respect to the reconciliation bill. They are fiscal moderates. They're more kind of what you would call a blue dog Democrat. In the House of Representatives, there's a larger progressive caucus that's very active. They're pushing for higher funding for the reconciliation bill. And the reason a lot of those programs are in a reconciliation bill and not in kind of a more typical bill is because the reconciliation process is this weird kind of budget tool that Congress can use to pass a bill with a simple majority. In the Senate, you need to have 60 votes unless you pass something through reconciliation, in which case you only need 50 votes. So that's why there's these two different bills that have very different components and different entities supporting them. On the primary infrastructure bill, quick update on that. This bill was passed through the Senate on August 10th, and it was passed by a pretty strong bipartisan vote, 69-30. As I mentioned, under regular order in the Senate, you need to have at least 60 votes to pass something to end cloture, and they got 69 votes. This bill has about a total of $1.2 trillion allocated to infrastructure over a period of about 5 years. And on the water side, it contains a number of provisions that I think would be beneficial to the West, including about $8.3 billion for the Bureau of Reclamation, $9.5 billion for the Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works programs, $55 billion for clean drinking water, $2 billion for the USDA Reconnect grant and loan program, $3.3 billion for wildfire. And it includes a lot of other programs as well. But those are some of the ones that are really kind of key interest, I think, to water managers. There's also some grant funding in there for, kind of what they're calling green infrastructure, but a vast majority is focused on kind of that concrete and steel element that I mentioned. Oops. On the reconciliation bill, I kind of skipped ahead to there. This is, as I mentioned, because there is the different majorities in the House and the Senate, and there's more of a progressive majority in the Democratic Party in the House, they have been leading on the reconciliation bill. This is a package that has largely been negotiated between the House of Representatives, the White House, and Senator Schumer, who's the majority leader in the Senate of the Democrats. Now, this package, as I mentioned, is much broader. Initially, they were looking at a package of about $3.5 trillion. That became a sticking point with both Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema over in the Senate. They thought that was too high. They were concerned about how much money that was going to be put out and some of the programs that was going to be targeted towards, specifically in the energy sector. We're hearing right now that negotiations have progressed kind of significantly in the last few weeks. The total of that, I've heard everything from like 1.3, 1.9 to 2 trillion. So it's definitely, I think 2 trillion at this point is the high. I think it's probably going to end up somewhere closer to 1.5, between 1.5 and $2 trillion. A lot of these negotiations are happening directly at the member level, though. And that's one of the things that has, and not only at the member level, but within a selected group of members of Congress. And so that's frustrated some of the folks in the House of Representatives, that they don't feel like there's enough information about the status of some of their priorities and things like that. From our perspective, the bill does have some things that would benefit, Western water. There is some good funding for Western wildfire in there. But we have not taken a position specifically on the bill because there's a lot of things that our members have communicated to us that they don't support or are not comfortable with that top line number. In addition to the traditional infrastructure things that I mentioned, there are other items in there, more social programs, things like, expansion of Medicaid and Medicare, universal pre-kindergarten At one point, there was universal community college funding, but I think that element has dropped out. There was also a relatively contentious energy program that would have paid utilities to switch to different forms of energy. That was an issue, or that was a program that Senator Manchin had a major issue with, and my understanding is that has currently been dropped out of the bill. But it is something that is very much in play. We have heard that the House could vote on something this week. But we've heard that before. Initially, they had a deadline of mid-October of getting something done. That came and went. So, we're watching it closely. It's not entirely clear what's going to happen at this point, though. So that's kind of on the funding side. There is a opportunity for water infrastructure to benefit from the infrastructure bill. We've been talking with the agencies, both the Corps, EPA, and Interior, about how they would allocate some of the funding that they would get in this legislation, and in this first infrastructure bill. Our understanding is that they're going to use existing programs to plus up. A lot of this money would go into existing programs, so they do have at least a mechanism to get it out. I've heard, and I'd be interested in hearing from all of you as well. I have heard that there are some challenges, though. If there's a 1 or 2 year time frame put on this, we've heard more it's going to be like a 5-6 year time frame, up to 8 years under this infrastructure bill to get some of this money out. We've heard there's challenges in the supply chain. We've also heard there are challenges in finding competent contractors that can put this money to work on the ground. So if this legislation passes, we do anticipate there being some hiccups in rolling the funding out. And if you do encounter that, please let us know so we can try to communicate that with Congress and try to get it squared away. Now, on the kind of the bad side, and again, nothing's entirely good or entirely bad, but we are seeing a pretty directed expanse of the regulatory environment from where it was just a couple of years ago. On the Clean Water Act, I don't think it's a bad regulation. I think everybody would agree that initially it was something that was definitely needed. It passed Congress back in the 70s, I think almost unanimously. But we're seeing an effort to kind of take it back in time to where it was before 2020. So as folks are probably aware, the primary area of contention is what is defined as a water of the United States. It's the basis for permitting and many other programs, and can have a direct impact both in terms of cost and in terms of time to developing water infrastructure projects. A couple key Supreme Court rulemakings that have shaped this that date back several years: the Swank case, or the Solid Waste Agency of North Cook County in Chicago, and then Rapanos from 2006. Now, I heard I'm borrowing this from one of NWRA's members in Idaho, who referred to a ping pong of Clean Water Act regulation. And that's, it's kind of what we're seeing. I mentioned that 2006 Rapanos case. Following that, the Bush administration issued guidance, the first Bush administration back in 2008, the Bush administration issued guidance on Rapanos implementation. Following that, in 2015, the Obama administration issued their Clean Water Rule. And I think most folks would agree that expanded the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. It was controversial. 32 different states litigated to stop that suit. And you had, for a short time, kind of a patchwork of where the Clean Water Act, which definition of navigable water or water of the United States you were dealing with. It was very challenging and complicated, and created kind of a tough regulatory environment for folks to try to navigate. When the Trump administration came in 2016, they announced that they were going to undertake an effort to develop a new rule. And in 2020, the Navigable Water Protection Rule was announced. It narrowed the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. I don't think it was perfect, but it was definitely better than the 2016 rule. Unfortunately, not everybody shared that opinion, and it was litigated by 20 states. So the 2015, you have 32 states litigating. 2020, you have 20 states litigating. So I think that just underscores, how controversial this bill can be, or this regulation can be. And part of the reason that it's so challenging to try to find to land on a good spot that provides the environmental protections that I think most folks would like to see. We don't want to see any rivers lighting on fire. Again, nobody wants that, but also allows folks to move forward with developing water infrastructure. So almost immediately, the Biden administration waded into the Clean Water Act. In January, and I'll mention this executive order several times, they issued an executive order which basically said they were going to take a look back at any regulations or rules issued in the prior 4 years. Then on June 9th, the EPA and the Department of the Army, the Corps, announced their intention to revisit the definition of waters of the United States. They're following a two-step process, which is actually kind of what the Trump administration did to undo the 2016 rule. First step is to undo the 2020 rule and go back to pre-15 law. So that's basically the 2008 guidance that the Bush administration put out. Once they do that, they're going to issue a second rulemaking process that will go in and expand on the 2008 guidance. So the term that they have used is they want to see a durable rule. I take that to mean kind of two things. One, they don't want to get litigated by 32 different states or 20 states or a majority or more than a dozen states. I don't know if it's possible to not get litigated on this, but I think that's one of the things they're hoping to do is avoid litigation. In our conversations with the agencies, we have said, well, durable is great, but it needs to be functional. That's kind of our goal. We need to see a rule that, as I mentioned earlier, provides that environmental protection that most folks would want to see, but also does not hinder or create an overly burdensome regulatory regime. So we recently, within the last month, NWRA provided comments on phase 1. And in that, we focused our comments on a couple different points. We encourage the agencies to really focus on the legal limits of the statute. We don't want to see the agencies go beyond what Congress has authorized in law. And oftentimes we do hear some conversations about, using different connectivity reports and things like that to look at the connections that occur through the water cycle, which, we all know that the water cycle, how it functions, we've all kind of understood that since grade school. But Congress didn't reference the water cycle when they were setting up what constituted a water of the United States. Just because water particle A, travels from a river to a groundwater to another water body does not necessarily mean that it is a navigable water. So that's one of the things that we're watching. We also want to retain the pre-2015 exemptions for agriculture and ditches. We also want to make sure that things like water recycling and stormwater features are exempt. And we also want to make sure that there is an opportunity to address disasters, wildfire response, flooding, things like that oftentimes requires you to get in and install or modify infrastructure. And we want to make sure that folks can do that in a timely manner. On October 13th, the agencies announced regional roundtables, and it's kind of an unusual thing. They're asking the general public to nominate representatives to sit on up to 10 different panels that would discuss what should be looked at in this rule. Those nominations need to be in by November 3rd. NWRA is working on a submission. We've reached out to a couple of other Western water user organizations and are hoping to do a joint submission. There's only going to be 10 of these regional roundtables, and the 2015 rule had over 1 million folks comment. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest in sitting on one of those roundtables, and we're going to try to make sure that Western Water has a voice that is part of that. The Clean Water Act isn't the only regulation we're seeing advanced or changed. One of the other foundational environmental rules is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. The Trump administration noticed that there was a need to update NEPA, and that there was an opportunity to make sure that projects got done in a more timely manner. And I think many of you probably remember then Secretary Bernhardt's memo on improving the regulatory timeframe, trying to get projects done quicker. I think most folks would agree that NEPA needed to be improved. I mean, when you've got numerous projects that are spending a decade plus in the permitting process, that tells you that something needs to be done better. In June of 2018, the prior administration noticed a proposal of a rulemaking to update NEPA. In 2020, that final rule was issued. Then in January, I mentioned that executive order. We had a change of administration at the beginning of the year. And you had executive order 13990 come into play. As part of that, as I mentioned, the agencies are going through and looking back at rules that were published in the prior 4 years. And that includes this NEPA rule. So on October 7th, the Council on Environmental Quality published a phase 1 notice of proposed rulemaking, initiating a 45-day comment period. Similar to the Clean Water Act, the agency or CEQ is looking at doing a 2-phase approach to this. Phase 1 would undo the 2020 Trump administration rule, and then phase 2 would look at, and there are some more details in that phase 1 of NEPA, looking at some specific questions about how you define an effect and things like that. But that's the basis they're trying to undo. And then that second rulemaking would build back. They held public meetings on October 19th and October 21st. NWRA participated in the October 19th meeting. And one of the things that we took away from that comment or from that meeting was the agency's reference that they want to see NEPA be the floor, not the ceiling of the regulation. And our comment to them in that meeting was, well, how do you do that? Congress has authorized NEPA to be what NEPA is. You can't adjust that. You can't inflate that. It is what it is. That's what the statute says. So we encourage them to stick very close to the statute. We also asked for an extension to the comment period. And we're probably we will be submitting a formal comment period request this week. Might even send it today, depending on if we're able to get a review out. But 45 days we feel like isn't sufficient, especially given the fact that we have the WOTUS rule going on right now. We have a number of things going on ESA, which I'll talk about, and now you have NEPA and stuff going on Pfas as well. So there's a lot going on. We think that if they want to see a meaningful public engagement, they should grant an extension to that comment period. We've hit on two of the kind of the foundational environmental laws, so we're going to hit on the third now, which is the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. Again, you'll notice Executive Order 13990 comes into play here. Trump administration has, over the last 4 years, they had worked on improving the Endangered Species Act. And actually some of the work that they picked up and finalized was work that had been started under the Obama administration. I think this goes back to the comment I made earlier about, there's no such thing as a purely good or purely bad regulation. And oftentimes you'll see some folks that are, when they're willing to get beyond the politics of the regulation, recognizing that these laws were created, all three of them were created back in the 70s. It's 2020, 21. It makes sense that we should revise them. There's been a lot of knowledge gained since that time frame. So we are a little bit disappointed to see these being backtracked as well, because we think that they were pretty common sense. But on June 4th, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NMFS, National Marine Fisheries, announced plans to revise or rescind 5 ESA regulations that were promulgated under the prior administration. 3 of these deal with critical habitat. If you guys have dealt with the Endangered Species Act, you know that critical habitat is one of the central components of it, because if something is designated as critical habitat for a species, it greatly reduces or prevents your ability to have any kind of impact in that area. So they're looking at rescinding fish and wildlife regulations on critical habitat designation exclusions, rescinding the regulatory definition of what constitutes habitat, revised regulations for listing species and designating critical habitats, what that process looks like, and then revising regulations for interagency cooperation. Oftentimes we have seen, especially in Pacific Northwest, you have 2 different competing biological opinions for 2 different species. And so you're kind of in this quagmire of darned if you do, darned if you don't. You can do one thing to benefit species A, and that inevitably has a adverse effect on species B. So you really are kind of stuck. And then reinstating a blanket 4D rule. So, that we're seeing the three kind of foundational environmental laws getting a serious look, but we're also seeing some new areas progress. And again, not saying that this is that dealing with PFAS and PFOA is a bad thing. I think that as the science develops on them, they're showing that there are a lot of harms to these chemicals, and so they are something that probably needs to be cleaned up. But it all depends on how you do it. And from a water management perspective, you need to realize that two things: one, water providers weren't the entities that put these chemicals in the environment, and two, if you are going to require water agencies to do the cleanup, you need to make sure that they have financial support to do so, and that any structure or level of cleanup that you require is something that is technically feasible. So last week, EPA announced its PFAS strategic roadmap. This is something that they've been working on for a while. It's not the first PFAS thing we've seen come out, and actually the prior administration started working on PFAS as well. But it sets a path for 2021 through 2024 for looking at PFAS regulation. And there are hundreds of different chemicals and chemical compounds that are considered a PFAS. And so this looks kind of at the issue more broadly. And then there are a couple of things that are looking at some of the more problematic and harmful PFAS within that family. But they're expected to undertake a nationwide monitoring for PFAS rule in 2021. We expect that rule really any day now. They're looking at establishing a national primary drinking water regulation with a final rule expected next fall of 2022. And then they're also looking at using NPD as permitting to reduce PFAS discharges to water. That is expected in winter of 2022. As I kind of mentioned at the start when I was talking about PFAS and PFOA, the key issues for NWRA are, make sure that any kind of requirement is actually achievable, and then make sure that those that put the chemicals there are helping pay for the cleanup. Don't shift the burden to water managers. They've got enough going on dealing with everything else. And right now, this is primarily a drinking water issue, but as regulations evolve, I do see the potential for it coming over to the agricultural and irrigation side as well. And that's because a lot of these chemicals make their way into foodstuffs. I mean, everybody sitting at this meeting right now, we currently have these chemicals, these compounds in our body. We take them in through food, we take them in through water. And the same thing can be said for livestock and crops. There is going to be trace amounts of these that end up in those organisms. So I think that the ag community should be kind of tracking how this develops, because it's not right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if eventually we see PFAS requirements at least emerge for water for agricultural applications. So the good, the bad, and now let's talk a little bit about the ugly. I don't want to, call Mother Nature ugly, because that's not a nice thing to do. But man, the weather she's provided this summer sure was not pretty. As you guys are probably well aware, because you're sitting in it. This was one of the worst drought years the West has ever experienced, and that led to a number of challenges. We had members from New Mexico to Oregon that in between that got zero water allocations, and drought exacerbates all those other challenges that you have to face, whether it's it's an infrastructure issue or a funding issue, because if you're not able to do assessments, it's creating some real challenges. And I know a lot of folks are having to sell off livestock and things like that. So there's not just going to be effects for this year, but there's going to be multi-year effects from this drought. And that has created drought is just one of many disasters that water users have had to face. Year to date, we've seen 18 what they call $1 billion disasters, and those are disasters that have a financial cost of at least $1 billion, and many of them are much higher than that. So, this year we've seen over $100 billion in disaster-related costs, and recently saw a study that mentioned that the time between these $1 billion disasters has dropped from over, I think it was like 80 days in the 80s to about 18 days on average over the past 5 years. I don't know if they accounted for inflation, which could have something to do with that, but I think that we are seeing more disasters, and that's creating a lot of challenges for water managers, because a lot of these disasters directly affect all of you, whether it's drought or fire or flood. The ability to continue water supply is critical to pretty much every sector of the economy, whether it's agriculture, industry, or communities. And every single one of those disasters can affect you all. So one of the things we all need to do is be, I think telling the story of ag can help quite a bit. And I know I've talked about, about 2/3 of my presentation hasn't been exactly rosy, whether it's talking about regulatory challenges or disasters and things like that. But it's not just Mother Nature. To pile on a little bit more, we're also seeing threats to the water industry coming from malicious individuals. This is a cyber warning that came out from the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and EPA just about 2 weeks ago. Just warning water managers to be aware of evolving phishing schemes and things like that. This is one thing. We can't control Mother Nature, but we do have the opportunity to try to mitigate some of these man-made threats. And the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency actually has a bunch of great resources. I put the URL up there for their resources page. They're great. NWRA is involved with them. We sit on their dam sector coordinating council. But we highly recommend folks check out their website, because they will literally come in and look at your water system and look at your tech protocols, and they'll help you develop security measures if you don't have any. They can tell you what you need to do, and they do it at no cost. There might be a little bit of a wait time, because I think that as ransomware attacks have gone up, I think that they're being more and more sought after. But I just encourage everybody to reach out to them, because they do have a lot of really good resources. So I know that it's not the most rosy update. At least 2/3 of it wasn't. The first part was relatively rosy. The last 2/3 maybe not so much. But I'm an eternal optimist, and there are always opportunities to make things better. And I think one of the things you guys can do right now is I remember working with UMWA when I was on Capitol Hill. So I know that your members are already doing this, and you do a good job of it. Jack and team do a wonderful job of keeping folks on the Hill informed and engaged. But just because DC is still relatively closed down doesn't mean you shouldn't be reaching out and talking to your members. You guys have some of the most influential members, especially in the Senate, when it comes to infrastructure. So utilize those relationships. Make sure that your voice is being heard in DC, or when your members are coming back. Here in DC, it's still kind of goofy. Most congressional meetings are still taking place virtually. We are starting to see a little bit of a shift, but I would say the majority of meetings are still taking place virtually. In the last month, we've had 2 groups come out to DC. The first group had every meeting except one virtual. So they came to our office and they sat there, and we set up the Zoom for them on the TV in the main floor. And, they Zoomed, 3 blocks over to their Senate offices and House offices. And then they had one in-person meeting, but they felt like that one in-person meeting was worth the trip out. We had another group that came out, and they had all of their meetings except one in person. Different states, different delegations, so I think that was part of it. But regardless of if you're doing it back home or if you're coming out to DC, I can't emphasize how important it is for you guys to tell the story of what you're doing and why water infrastructure is important to not just your community, the West, but also the entire nation and the world. Because as I've said often, and you guys may have heard me mention this at your meetings before, I'm pretty good at eating stuff, but I'm not so good at growing stuff. So we need you guys both on the ground and communicating your stories. There are a couple of funding opportunities I wanted to mention real quick as well. These are for Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart grants. All Upper Missouri water user members are in reclamation states, and so your water district should be eligible for these funding opportunities. I apologize, I think it says 3 funding opportunities. There's only 2 open right now. And those are water and energy efficiency grants and environmental water resource project grants. And you can get up to $2 million for individual projects. The application period for the water and energy efficiency grants is coming up pretty quick here, but on the environmental water resource projects, you have a little bit more flexibility. I mentioned this, I also put their website there. And when you go to it, this is just a screenshot, so I can't click through, but if you go to the link on the prior page, this will pop up. And right on the right-hand side there, you'll see where you can click to check out those 2 funding opportunities. And I mention them because reclamation is probably going to get a big infusion of cash, either through the continuing resolution, which right now it's their appropriations for this year, which is going to end in December, but they'll probably get a bump there. And then if the infrastructure bill moves forward, there's going to be a big infusion of cash here as well. So definitely encourage folks to apply for these projects, because whether you get it now or a great deal of funding is ready next year. If you've already filled out an application, you can just update it. So I strongly encourage folks to do that. I know that there was, wanted to save a little bit of time for questions. So I think we got a couple of minutes. Jack, Julie, is that accurate, or do you need me to hop off?
Nope, we've got, this is the last agenda item for the day. And so we can field as many questions as you'd like to. Yeah.
Well, if I'm standing between you guys and a cold beer, that might not be a good thing. But well, I guess it's earlier out there though, so you guys still got a couple hours. So, but yeah, happy to take questions. My contact info is here. If you do happen to have something that pops in your head after the meeting that you want to reach out, always happy to take questions. And I'll use this as an opportunity to shamelessly plug NWRA's meeting. We're going to be meeting in Chandler, Arizona, November 8, 9, and 10. If anybody wants to come out and enjoy some 75-degree weather, I'd love to see you.
Yeah, we did have some discussion at the board level. Ian, what would it cost a group like the Upper Missouri to join the NWRA?
We do have a associate memberships available, and it'd be $1,000. And our dues for next year would that'd be $1,000. With that, you get member registration prices to all of our events. You get access to our daily news, policy updates. And yeah, would love to work with you guys more. It's always a pleasure to interact with you. And I know that we get to work with a lot of you all as individual members through your various states, but it'd be great to have UMWA as a full member of the association. Especially given all the work you guys have going on up there in water infrastructure. There's a lot of exciting things going on. So it'd be good to highlight some of that.
Any questions for Ian? Well, hearing none, thank you again, everyone. These days are pretty long, these virtual convention days. Get a little screen fatigue